Welcome to the Benefits of Knowledge podcast with Lorne Curry of Curry Financial Group Limited. In this podcast, we are focused on helping businesses set up and manage their group benefit plan to protect and assist their most valuable assets. Join us on this journey where Lorne explores ways to help you develop effective and cost-efficient strategies for your business. Now, on to the show.
Hello and welcome to the Benefits of Knowledge with Lorne Curry. Today, Lorne has a guest on the show. That is Mike McClenahan. Mike is a VP of Partner Solutions with People Corporation. In his role, Mike strategizes and develops innovative group benefit solutions to help working Canadians and their families stay healthy, happy, and financially secure. Mike is also the president of TPAAC, which stands for Third Party Administrator Association of Canada. TPAAC strives to act as a collective voice to create a financially strong third-party administration industry in Canada. Mike can regularly be seen in the Port Coquitlam community because Mike spends his downtime volunteering for Motion Ball, an organization that raises awareness and funds for the Special Olympics Canada Foundation, and exploring the outdoors of his home province of British Columbia, which I love British Columbia, Lorne. Lorne, thank you so much for bringing Mike on the show. Why'd you bring him on the show today?
Well, I think Mike's going to have a little different perspective. So we brought him on. I would like him to answer, questions that clients ask me. Mm-hmm. So coming from the supplier side of the business, I think Mike's going to be able to offer some unique insights into those questions.
Fantastic. Well, I'm here to learn from both of you again. I enjoy spending time with you, Lorne. Thank you so much for putting this podcast on.
My pleasure. So Mike, just glad you're able to join us this morning. I know you got a time difference out there, so it's a little earlier for you than it is for us, but I didn't get you up as early as last week.
Double caffeinated, so there you go.
All right, good. So we're ready to go. We may have a hard time stopping you. All right. Okay, so people might be a little confused. You work for People Corporation now, and of course that's recent, and you're going to explain that. But people that aren't familiar with BBD, that's Benefits by Design, can you tell us a little bit about that organization and your association with the People Corporation, just so people kind of understand where you're coming from?
Yeah, the context, absolutely. Yeah, so I've been a managing partner with Benefits by Design for over 20 years. And what Benefits by Design is referred to as a third-party administrator, or TPA, in our industry. So we're not an insurer. We can't bear risk, as it were, but think of us as both a distribution arm for group insurance products as well as a back-end administrator. And what a third-party administrator essentially does is creates a best-in-class solution for advisors and their customers. So the notion being that depending on what the priorities and objectives of the customer is, layered on again with the advice of the consultant, is we can pick and choose solutions from various providers. Most of the time we're talking insurers. But there's also additional employee assistance providers, et cetera, and come to the table with a solution that's more customized for the plan sponsor ultimately. And so we'd been doing that very happily and very successfully on a national basis for about 20 years, as I said. And then about 4 months ago, we joined a larger organization called People Corporation, who are also national in Canada, head office in Winnipeg. And really that is an opportunity to scale, and being part of a larger dynamic organization allows us to sort of meet the needs of more working Canadians. And maybe just last thing I'll mention, our mission statement, which actually aligned very well with People Corporations, is just that, to help working Canadians by promoting and protecting their health, wealth, and happiness. And again, we distribute those benefits by design through advisors like yourself across the country.
Perfect. That's a great explanation. I can say I've probably dealt with BBD for, I'm thinking, close to 20 years. I think I had my first group there. So Mike and I have never met in person, but I've certainly been on lots of webinars and meetings and heard Mike speak, which is why I wanted to get him on the podcast. So
we'll have to change that in-person thing in the near future, Lorne.
Yes. As soon as we can get back on a plane. Actually, my wife is heading out to BC in September. Unfortunately, I don't get to go. She's going with her sisters and her mom. So actually, this podcast may come out while she's out there. So, but anyway, next time I'll come. We have a niece out there and love to go out and do some hiking and BC is just a beautiful place. So
Great.
Okay, great. So, all right. So with BBD, it's a third-party administrator. Again, the whole idea of, getting different benefits covered by different companies, trying to put all the best pieces together. Hopefully everybody understands that. So what's your new role as you move forward now that People Corporation?
Yeah, since joining People Corporation?
Yes.
Yeah. So actually, it hasn't changed other than I have the opportunity to play in a larger sandbox. So my role today, as it was before, is really split into two buckets. One is very much on the business development side broadly, and that's working with our around 1,000 advisors across the country. Again, more in a supportive education role, advocacy where it makes sense, as well as working with our very own sales team. And then the other one where I spend probably a little more than 50% of my time is at the industry level. So the introduction, there was a mention of TPAAC, or the Third Party Administrators Association of Canada, so which is an industry association representing TPAs across the country. And I've been in the president role there, as we said, for, I keep losing track of time now, but I think it's close to 10 years. Very fulfilling role, great group of other organizations. And it's an interesting dynamic because on the one hand, there are times certainly where we are competitors to each other. But that said, the work that we do within TPAAC is very much about raising the bar of the industry as it relates to third-party administration. There's a fair amount of government regulatory work, important stuff. Needless to say, because we are part of insurance and financial services, it's as it should be, a highly regulated industry. So, a decent amount of that work is dealing with government, as well as other industry stakeholders and so on. There's a few other industry associations that I'm involved with, including one called CALU, which is the Conference of Advanced Life Underwriting, and Advocates, Lorne, that you'd be familiar with, which is more about the Financial Advisors Association of Canada, et cetera. But what I, as I say, thoroughly enjoy is it's not just, sort of the tactical work, regulatory or otherwise, we do there, but, the opportunity it gives me to meet other people with a like mindset, which again really does, I think, boil back to that, how can we make the offerings, the protection, et cetera, for Canadians, better, in terms of protecting them and against financial hardships and so on.
Right. Sounds very interesting. I'm sure the TPAAC thing has got to be very interesting, working with so many others in the industry. I know you already deal with about 4,000 customers through there and 1,000 advisors like myself. But dealing, again, I find we have competitors in the business. You and I are both members of CGIB, which is our Group Benefit Association. Actually, a little heads up, Dave Patriarch is going to be coming on and talking a little bit in our next podcast, I believe it is. And that's going to be tied back to BBD and something you guys were working on. So I'm going to keep everybody in suspense on that. They're going to have to tune in next month to find out what that's about. So I guess, you're trying to work on making things better for everyone. So what do you see, both as the challenges and the opportunities in your market space to enable this innovation, which again, we're going to talk about more later, and better outcomes for employers and employees?
Yeah, good question. And for some context, so when you mentioned that we do administration, servicing, and so on for now, I think this is probably my notes to you were a bit outdated. I think it's about 4,400 now. So yay.
Wow. Great.
But most of those customers fall into what we would think of as the SMB, like the small mid-sized business. For the most part, let's say under 100 employees. And one of the interesting things you find about those types of employers is often they don't have, sort of internal robust HR departments. Using our organization as a comparison, it wasn't until I think we reached about 50 employees that we actually hired what you'd think of as a dedicated HR specialist. Before that, it was more, somebody who, you're the office manager, so you get that job kind of thing. So I only bring that up as sort of acknowledging, and I'm assuming you would come across this with your clients as well, that, as a result, they don't necessarily have the same expertise when it comes to sort of these HR issues, how they dovetail, with benefits design and so on and so forth. And so the result of that, but this also amplifies the value of the advice that folks like yourself bring to the table, is, that sort of KISS principle I find in our market space becomes very important, the keeping it simple. I won't add the final S. And so, they have similar issues as the large employers, but the ability to execute sometimes on like a complex drug formulary, as an example, can be a challenge because they may not have the same internal communication, channels and all these sorts of things. So that can be one of the challenges. From an opportunity standpoint, though, too, I find that those smaller employers can be much more nimble and dynamic in terms of their decision making. So as much as we don't get involved in the advice giving, we leave that to the advisor community. But I've seen and heard of situations of larger employers that the execution and decision making can get bogged down in big committees and oversight and governance and all this, which can be important, but it's just challenging when it comes to implementing things. So that's kind of I would say sort of the pro and con.
Right. Yeah. I can confirm. Okay. Usually the bigger the company I'm dealing with, the longer it takes to get anything done. Having said that, though, as you did mention, hopefully a lot of our listeners on the podcast are actually HR managers. We're really trying to help get the word out to them, help educate them about group benefits. So when you have an HR manager, it might be slower for things to happen, but the communication to the employees, I believe, is better in the long run. So, like you said, there's pros and cons.
Sure. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So, as we all know, despite their clinical benefits, more and more high-cost drugs have been coming into the market and stressing the affordability of drug and health plans for employers. Are you seeing employers reacting by implementing more drug maximums?
Yep. We actually took a look at that question a number of months ago by doing a bit of an internal analysis of our block of, let's say, those 4,000 plus employers. And if I look at it, let's say, on a 10-year span, so say current versus 2011. So if we go back 10 years ago, the number of plans that we were administering that had unlimited, so no caps on their drug coverage, was about 63%. And 10 years later, that number has dropped to 49%. So a fairly substantial increase in the number of employers who have chosen to put in a drug cap. What's interesting also, and this was probably the part that surprised me a little bit more, is what kind of caps they're putting in. So if you'd asked me before doing the analysis, where would I have suggested most of that went? I probably would have said a $10,000 cap. What's interesting, though, is the 10,000 stayed the same. So 10 years ago, 20% of the employers had a $10,000 drug cap. It's actually exactly the same today. Most of it went to a $5,000 cap. So 3% 10 years ago had a $5,000 cap. That number has increased to 15%. So it's interesting, again, every situation is going to be different as to why they've done that. But and you can probably speak to this too, Lorne, my sense would be that the main theme would be one of affordability. So whereby if they have been getting hit with some larger drug costs and then facing some big increases in their premiums, they probably said, well, what are our options? And
yep.
It's a bit of a blunt object or strategy, but it doesn't make it bad. to then say, let's put in a cap and sort of cap our risk and exposure as well. The ultimate challenge, as you would know, is you're now transferring that risk onto the employee and their dependents to some degree as well.
Yeah. So 100% what you're saying is funny. When I was preparing for this, I didn't actually get my list out and go through it, but $5,000 is definitely the drug cap. That if my clients are having a drug cap, that's the number, right? But I would guess in my block, maybe 10 to 15% of all my clients would have a drug cap at all.
Right. With the rest being unlimited sort of thing for the most part?
The rest, yeah, just unlimited. There's some other controls, of course, there, but basically unlimited. And the clients that have the drug caps generally are, I would say, more of my smaller clients. And it's an affordability thing, right? Can they afford if there's a large dollar claim? Of course, we have stop loss and stuff, which that's going to be my next question. But, can they afford to have that big bump in their premiums? And when they say no, they can't, they have a certain budget. This is what we have to work with. That's generally how we ended up going to that $5,000 drug cap.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. So anyway, as I kind of alluded to, stop loss, whatever you want to call the stuff, but so what about pooling levels? Okay, maybe you can explain. That's a little hard sometimes explain to my clients. So what's happening with the pooling levels, and what's the year-over-year trends in pooling levels looking like, and their pricing?
Right. Yeah. And good point, Lorne, in terms of, often to employers, again, depending on their level of sophistication and knowledge, they may not understand or appreciate. It's almost like there's insurance within their insurance. And this, as you and I both know, pertains primarily to the extended health programs. And, the notion that a small amount of your health premium is being set aside to cover these sort of really high dollar risk items. Historically, and you and I know both been in the business for some time, that was probably, decades ago, more of for things like travel coverage, where, very infrequent events, but the dollar figure could be significant. And over time, high cost drugs have really overtaken the main cost of pooling, and stop loss is just the industry term for what is pooling. And I won't dig into it, but there's been various industry efforts, well intended, to try to figure out how to, and I don't think anybody can solve it per se, but sort of even it out or smooth, the adjustments a little bit. But despite that, the reality is, pharma, and it's not a bad thing, but it creates a friction point of sustainability and affordability of these plans. Pharma has invested a lot of money and will continue to into what are sort of generally referred to as specialty or biologic drugs. And many of them have enormous positive impacts for the individuals suffering from various illnesses and things, but they come with these enormous price tags. For example, I was actually speaking with a fella yesterday who's sort of quasi-government in Quebec, and he heads up the organization that works with the government to figure out sort of the pooling for the government plans. Yes. And he said the biggest claim that they are covering right now is a $2.2 million annual. Now, it's a big outlier, right? But just to give some context that those sorts of things are out there. The other one that's coming down the pipe more as a class is oncology or cancer drugs, but that will be like you can take as a pill, as opposed to receiving treatment in hospital, chemo, etc., which again, apparently can have incredibly positive effects, far fewer side effects for people suffering from these illnesses. But the big challenge becomes if those medications, which with a high cost, start being administered outside of the hospital environment, then they become the responsibility of private plans instead of public healthcare for the most part. Right. So these are all sort of the cost inputs that are driving this sort of friction. If we look at our block as, sort of the trend, as you said, I'll use just a 5-year sort of set of analysis. And a typical stop loss within these programs, as you would know, would say, if a claimant has health claims in excess of $10,000 in a year, then the insurer is going to pool above the $10,000. And so within our block, over the past 5 years, we've seen a 115% increase in the number of claimants. So the number of people today is up over double from what it was 5 years ago, who are breaching, if I can put it that way, that $10,000 per year.
Yeah, that's surprising, isn't it? That's a big number.
It certainly has a trend line. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's not quite the same percentage increase in the actual dollar exposure, but it's more of an indication of, there are more of these drugs and there are more people who are using them for the various therapies. And again, it's not necessarily a bad news story, because think of it this way. Imagine an individual who was suffering from a chronic illness of some kind, that without this therapy, perhaps they are on disability, or government support if their employer doesn't provide disability coverage. So would you make that trade between, having to pay for the high cost drug, versus, again, them not receiving that because they can't afford it, and therefore being in a situation almost societally where they're, not because they don't want to, but they can't contribute, et cetera, because of their debilitating illness.
Exactly. I think a couple of the big ones that I see in my plans is going to be arthritis, right? Mm-hmm. Is huge. Crohn's and colitis. There's quite a bit of that we see. And then I guess one of the bigger ones that come in that are at least short term, there's a cure for hepatitis C. And,
right.
I think that's anywhere from $80,000 to $120,000, just to give people, again, some ideas that, they're not all $1 million claims, but if you get a whole bunch of claims that are 40, 65, 100,000, that stuff adds up, right? So. Yeah,
exactly. And actually, the Hep C one you bring up, Lorne, it's a really interesting one from sort of a private versus public policy responsibility. And again, as you know, one of the challenges is healthcare. We're in the middle of an election right now. I'm not going to say anything political. But, for every election, healthcare is always this sort of hot potato issue. But regardless, it is a provincial responsibility. So I'm based in British Columbia, as noted at the beginning, and BC is one of the provinces that has, sort of a broad-based pharmacare program. And that hepatitis C drug, the pharmacare program in BC, not immediately, they had to do some analysis and efficacy work and so on, but they ultimately said, we are going to cover that drug. Right. So for the most part, it became a public responsibility cost-wise. And the rationale, which I wholeheartedly agree with, is they looked at it and said, well, the downstream impact of curing this disease or not curing it, where a therapy is available, would have a significant impact on public health care, in terms of people having to go to the hospital, et cetera, right? Let alone, It's just good for these people if we can cure them of this illness. But that wasn't necessarily the decision in every province, at the end of the day, because of this sort of patchwork. But just an interesting example.
Yes. Yeah. Because we don't have that here in Ontario. I can tell you, I got a whole bunch of group clients that wish that drug was covered by the province, because it's it's created some unpleasant renewals. I'll just put it that way.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Okay. All right. That's that's interesting. So just kind of changing directions here. For those that aren't necessarily working directly on group renewals, again, we're hoping we've got a lot of the HR managers, finance people, and business owners out there, but not everybody works on the group renewals. So they may not be aware of why we're seeing trend factors quoted in drug trend reports like those from ESC, TELUS, IMC. They're far lower than when I take a renewal in and I show a plan sponsor what we're saying the trend and inflation factors are going to be on their healthcare. Can you explain some of the reasons why there's such a difference?
Sure, yeah. And some of this will be kind of I'm speculating. So I'm not referring to a report, but to use some recent stats, and won't worry about who these organizations are, but generally what they're seeing internally in their data would say that the annual increase in drug, and this is again mostly on the drug side, drug costs is running 5-6%, something along those lines. And as you know, Lorne, when you deliver a typical renewal, it varies by insurer and a little bit by province and so on, but minimum, I would say 10% is what is typically embedded, more commonly probably pushing up into close to 15% in some cases. So I think you'd need to get an actuary or an underwriter on here to give any sort of technical answer to this. But what I believe happens here for the most part is it's kind of like the cell phone thing a little bit with companies that, they might treat a new customer a little better than an existing customer. And so the aspect is, as you would know, and it comes in waves and cycles, but there's often very aggressive quoting that goes on from insurers to acquire new business, right? Even to the degree of, I would say, sometimes consciously underpricing the business. So and insurers aren't created to lose money. Again, I'm not trying to paint the insurers as bad in this because our entire industry has a role to play in the delivery side of this. But as a result, to balance the books, as it were, so if you are underpricing a lot of your new business, but you want your block to still be, I'd say on-side and somewhat profitable, well, there's only one other place to get that money from. And I think it's also a recognition that, not all of the advisor community is comfortable with sort of positioning value over price to some degree, other than a little shout out to Dave Patriarch you're mentioning, the CGIB folks. And so it's very common, and we see this as a supplier where, some advisors, they never accept sort of the first renewal proposal, even if it appears based on the numbers very fair and justified, et cetera. So again, I think there's a little bit of this, I hate to call it padding, but I don't have a better word. And one place you can pad a little bit is in these trend factors, and then use that as sort of a bit of a negotiation lever as well. So I think that's why, for the most part, there's something of a disconnect between what the data would say and then what you see offered out through renewals.
Right. Okay. That's a really big topic. Actually, if our listeners remember, or if they haven't seen it, if they went back to episode 10 of our podcast, I did a whole podcast on marketing your group. And a big part, so when I'm delivering a renewal, I do the mathematical calculations of what I feel the numbers need to be based on a fair renewal. Okay. We don't like changing carriers if we don't need to, as long as there's no service issues, that type of thing. I understand insurance companies need to, they have to be profitable or they're not going to be in business. None of us are. But in marketing, it really, I guess, upsets me maybe if you see somebody in my role say, market a program, and they're not, they get an insurance company to give them a quote where the premiums being collected for health or dental are not enough to cover what last year's claims were. Right?
Right.
And that's exactly what we run into. That is one of the biggest conversations that I have with my clients, whether it's at a renewal or, if we're coming into a brand new client, we're doing a marketing, marketing does have to be done, but I really think it's so important that the people in our industry educate the clients, the people that are paying the bills, on if you take that bottom line dollar, quote, what's happening to you next year? Because I can tell you, as the advisor, I don't want to be the guy delivering a renewal. Oh, I just saved you 25% this year, but I'm delivering a renewal next year that's going up 40%. Right?
Yeah. And I'm sure you alluded to in that previous podcast, Lorne, but you know too, like even if a customer said, well, what's the downside, right? Why, if a big insurance company is willing to subsidize my benefits program, why wouldn't I accept that? But as you know, there are, other than the disruption factor, which can be very real for plan sponsors and their employees,
yes.
is there are, I don't want to call them hidden costs, but there are costs of switching. But again, I would think you would have gone into that.
Yes. Yeah, we did. Yeah. All right. Well, very good. Okay. Again, the whole idea of having Mike join us today is to get, kind of get that perspective from, I don't know if I like to say the other side, not where we're competing or anything, but, just that different point of view, because, I come on here and say things like, don't take the lowest quote, make sure you check the numbers first. So it's nice to hear you're kind of feeling the same thing from your side of things. So.
Like we've never, again, and then we'll move off this topic, but, and I don't want to say we're all lily white and pure, that, we've never been caught in that trap a little bit ourselves, but, we're not a big insurance company with, these huge reserves, et cetera. So, and I would say generally this is a position of third-party administrators, we have to make our money based on value. Right? Because we don't make our money on, because we're not bearing risk on being a beneficiary of the risk pools, as it were. So therefore, in a pure sense, it forces us in a good way to, focus on, that value side. Because if we play that game of just discounting price and jacking up the rates, the customers and their advisors should punish us at the end of the day.
Right. Okay. Well, then so we'll move on. Again, referring back here, our seventh episode of the Benefits of Knowledge podcast, we actually talked about virtual healthcare.
Okay.
COVID has certainly thrown us all more into the digital world. I live in it now, it seems. I don't go out on the road anymore. Has it accelerated innovation and adoption by employers and plan members in the health space?
Yeah, it's interesting. It certainly, poured a lot of fuel on that out of necessity. And I'll start with a bit of an example and a context on public healthcare, which is, I'm sure a lot of your listeners now have had, doctor's appointments that were either digital or by phone or what have you. Like, quick example for me is I do some of that outdoor stuff I love doing that you referred to before. Part of it is mountain biking. And I had a little bit of a crash, it's probably closing in on 6 months ago, where I tweaked my knee and it's been giving me grief, et cetera. So my public healthcare experience there was, a Zoom call with my doctor who had me, sort of try to move about, et cetera. Followed up by, a requisition of an x-ray, followed up not that long ago with a chat with him just over the phone of him looking at the x-ray results and then suggesting some, stretching and exercise and whatnot. But so, not once during that process did I, have to book an appointment. Well, booked an appointment, but not have to figure out getting to his office, waiting in his office, et cetera. And it's interesting, a recent survey that the Canadian Medical Association did of, a set of Canadians was that they said 91% of patients were satisfied using virtual care. And 46% of those people said they would prefer a virtual method as a first point of contact, at least with their doctor, moving forward. And then again, another high percentage, over 2/3, said they're in favor of continuing with this sort of telemedicine approach, even after the pandemic is over. So I think generally Canadians have found that interaction, admittedly that was public healthcare, with the system, as it were, has been generally pretty favorable. I think there will need to be some review and assessment of effectiveness, because I think a lot of this, understandably, during COVID has been driven out of necessity, not out of, is this going to lead to better outcomes for those individuals? So that same kind of discussion now flows over to the private healthcare space. And And you'd have some sort of experience on this too. I would say generally what we found, and I think good initially, that the providers, insurers, and otherwise have done a bit of a, what can we bolt into the programs that's digital, right? And there was a bit of a, like, I always like using the grade 8 dance analogy, which is, if you were like me, you were the kids leaning against the wall. You weren't the first person to run out and ask somebody to dance, but nobody wanted to be that last person, leaning against the wall. So there was this flurry of activity, of partnerships with these digital providers and, announcements saying it's now, included with your benefits program, et cetera. And even though often they might be positioned as, no charge, that's not saying they're lying, but there's a cost, and there should be, to some of these programs. So that's been sort of what's happening over the last couple of years, and again, very much accelerated by COVID. And mental health, as you'd know, is probably a big space where that's happening. And I think that's especially one where reviews and assessment need to look at effectiveness. So there's something, for example, called CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a well-founded scientific method for helping people with various mental health issues. And so this ICBT, which is the virtual side of it, is really been developing significant. And I think one of the ways that our industry can improve some of these, and again, I'm not a clinician, so let me throw that disclaimer out there.
Right.
But generally what I've noticed is the approach has been kind of blanket. Like, do your best to have all plan members be aware of these services. And what I think could be more interesting, again, this is assuming appropriate use of data and privacy and consent and all those types of things, if there's any lawyers listening, but would be, so imagine this scenario. Imagine a plan member is getting a first start prescription for a mental health drug. Okay. And again, let's also assume that the pharmacological solution is a part of the system. Wouldn't it be interesting to be able to message that patient and plan member sort of basically in that moment while they're dealing with this, saying, we completed your prescription, et cetera, and whatever other messaging is needed there. Did you know that as part of your benefits program, you have access to these other services, which may be complementary, whether that be counseling or CBT or what have you, and here's your path to access as a result. And there are, we're doing an experiment right now with an advisor, a large customer of his, and the service providers to try and enable that type of outreach, and then to measure and see, was it effective, and so on and so forth.
Wow, that sounds really interesting. Yeah. All right. Well, this has been great, Mike. So I think, we did a podcast a while ago on, virtual health and stuff, and talked about a lot of, kind of the same things that you're saying here, where people were very pleased with it. Anybody I've talked to that's used, the virtual healthcare side of things, definitely, are preferring to deal that way, like you said, on the first contact. So,
can I leave you with one humorous story?
Certainly.
Which you can always edit out afterwards if you want to, which is this sort of virtual and telemedicine is starting to go into areas that I think people will go, really? You can do that virtually? And the one experience I had was physiotherapy, of all things. So this organization, they're actually called Physio with a Z, and they've been starting to grow in terms of their penetration in Canada and so on. And when they first came on my radar, which is pre-COVID, it's probably a little over 2 years ago, they explained how the service works, et cetera. And I remember saying to the fella, I said, well, there's no better way to sort of evaluate effectiveness and all this sort of stuff than, having a live example. And it was shortly after Christmas, and I'd been at a customer Christmas function up in Kelowna. Again, pre-COVID, folks. And we happened to find ourselves late at night at a sort of country and western bar. And around midnight, this mechanical bull emerges from the floor. And I just happened to be in pretty close proximity. So, perhaps a little bit of liquid courage, signed the waiver for him. Of course, didn't read it.
Right.
And I think it was the first person to jump on the mechanical bull. I didn't come close to 8 seconds. And I think it was, a couple of days later, I was going, oh boy, my shoulder is really sore. So I'd wrenched it somehow. So that was actually how I ended up, using this physio sort of virtual service, which was, for that injury that I had, effective at the end of the day.
Great. Well, it's funny. When I first heard of that stuff coming out, I'm thinking, well, I've taken physio and stuff. And I was wondering how they did it virtually, but that's good to hear that they it still works that way. I guess they're showing you the exercise and then you can do it, right? So good.
Yeah.
Right.
The one thing I found interesting about I've certainly, because of my clumsiness at mountain biking for the most part, had plenty of visits to the bricks and mortar physiotherapy over the years. But the one piece I would say that was interesting, and I think a positive, so the virtual has lower cost of delivery and these sorts of things. And they admit there are certain injuries that you have to go to a bricks and mortar physiotherapy. But the accountability piece was interesting. So for anybody who has used a physiotherapist in the past and you go for your next week visit, et cetera, and what is it the physiotherapist always asks you, when you come in? They say, have you been doing your exercises? And of course, I kind of go, yeah. Just like with the dentist, have you been flossing? Right. Too much information, but yeah. Whereas, so the digital delivery, they know, right? So and I would actually get this. I would get little friendly reminder pings from the platform saying, hey, we miss you. We notice you haven't been in to do your exercises for the past 2 days. Is there anything we can help? So it has that little bit of digital oversight, trying to use it in a positive encouragement way, but they would know whether people are actually doing their exercises or not.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, that's definitely going to be a bonus over, you're not going to go to the physio clinic every day. So that's great.
Right. Yeah.
All right. Well, that's great. I think we're going to be out of time here. So I thank you very much, Mike. This has been excellent. I think our listeners are going to get a lot out of today's podcast. And I thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Really enjoyed it.
Mike, fantastic stuff. I appreciate you being on the show as well, so thank you for being here. Lorne, of course, a big thank you to you for bringing Mike on the show. Before I go into the closing, Lorne, I know you do these for educational purposes, and you pointed to a few podcasts that you did in the past, and actually even gave out the number, so I'm hoping the listener cues in on that and goes back and listens to those. But for those that have been listening and are saying, you know what, I need to have a conversation with Lorne because I love the stuff that he's putting out as far as all the education that he does, and I could use some help with my company and my benefits. Remind them again how they get a hold of you, please.
Okay. Well, you can pick the phone up, give us a call on our toll-free number, 1-866-445-4424. That gets you right into the office here. Otherwise, you can pop me an email. It's lorne@curryfinancialgroup.com. Of course, happy to answer questions on any of these topics. And yeah, if you need help with your plan, we're more than happy to do an analysis for you.
Absolutely. Again, Lord, thank you so much for today. And our last thank you always goes to you, the listening audience. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to the Benefits of Knowledge podcast with Lorne Curry. If you have not subscribed to the podcast yet, please click the subscribe now button below. This way, when Lorne comes out with a new podcast, it'll show up directly on your listening device. This makes it much easier to share these podcasts with your colleagues. Again, thank you so much for listening today. For everyone at Curry Financial Group, this is Eric Johnson reminding you to live your best day every day. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Benefits of Knowledge podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available.